So, I know something happened that was very disturbing for you when you
Yeah,
were on active duty. Can you share with us what that
yeah, it was when
is?
I was at AIT at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and I was raped, and it was a fellow classmate and and a friend of his, and it messed me up. And
I'm so sorry.
yeah, so
That's horrible.
I thought, I mean, that was, I mean, my whole naivety. However, no, I'm not going to be, but
Naivete.
naivete, and I thought that the guys who I met when I was in the army, when I were the same like the guys that I went to Suami College with, and we were all friends and we all hung out with each other in each other's rooms or whatever, and we all went to different places together and we were fun. And so that was my life
Uh-huh.
experience. And it was the same with high school in my little town, is that, we were all friends and it was always, they were safe places. And of course, I
Did
blamed
you
myself
report?
and
Yeah.
continued to blame myself. And of course, I never said a word. And I guess that is my issue with the armed forces. I know they're making it more vocal now, but I know that they knew it was happening and
Yeah.
they had no avenues to report, no encouragement, no nothing. It was, and I know that it happened in basic training too, and other platoons. I know it happened there. And and at the time I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm not in that platoon. But it that was when I was at AIT at Fort Monmouth, and it was life before and life after. So,
Hi. Today is January 31st of 2025, and my name is Kyle Liston. I'm here today at the Rocky Mountain Regional VA in Aurora, Colorado, and we are interviewing Kathryn Raevuori, who is patient of the Charles George VA Medical Center in Asheville, North Carolina, and she is a resident of Hendersonville, North Carolina, and she is coming to share her experiences in the Army and her life history with us today, and we appreciate her being here. So, Kathryn, I'm going to start by bringing you back to your childhood. If you could tell us a little bit about where and when you were born and your family, your siblings, if you have siblings, and what your school life was like and your spiritual religious life was like when you were growing up.
okay, well, I was born in Conneaut, Ohio, which is on Lake Erie. And I have two brothers and my mother and my father, but let's see here. I've got my grew up in a bit of a Finnish community because my mother's parents were immigrants, and my father himself came from Finland. And so
Uh-huh.
we lived in a typical neighborhood, I guess, of the time. And my father, though, left when I was in kindergarten. He abandoned us and went back to Finland. And so my mother was a single parent before there
Uh,
was a term for it. And she raised the three of us on her own on next to nothing. But we we had I had a couple of aunts who took a great interest in me, and we were part of a church family, Good Shepherd Lutheran. At the time, it was Faith Lutheran. It was founded by the Finns. My grandfather, my papa, helped build it, but then we ended up merging with another church. So that was a huge part
Was
of.
that a
Pardon? Yeah. So that
was that a Lutheran Church
yeah,
of America?
yeah. At the time, it was LCA. Now it's ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church. It started out Suomi Synod, and Suomi is Finnish for Finland, but then it was absorbed into LCA, and then LCA became part of the ELCA. So we had Camp Luther, which started out Suomi Synod also, and that was in Anit. But the Finns did tend to settle along the Great Lakes, so there was Anit, Ashtabula, and Fairport Harbor, and we all had, for us, major Finnish populations. Anybody else, they were tiny Finnish populations. But so between the church and my mother, and she was an incredibly decent person, we stumbled along, and all three of us ended up going to college, which didn't seem like a possibility because we were poor. But I was the one who didn't make it through at the time.
You did.
So what else did you ask here? What else?
What was it like growing up in a Finnish community?
Well, things were pretty normal for me. I mean, it didn't seem, but I never learned the language. My oldest brother did because they were living in Finland when he was when he learned to speak. But John and I weren't. They had moved back to the States. So they spoke a lot of Finnish at home, and the kids in the neighborhood made fun of us a lot. But our food was different. Coffee. They're the biggest consumers of coffee in the world per capita. Sauna. We used to go to sauna on Saturday nights. My grandfather had built a sauna, and then we had Mrs. Viitanen, and so often on Saturday nights we went to sauna, and to me it just it was normal. I found out when I was working at Camp Luther that saunas aren't normal for people. But because the Finns founded Camp Luther. So a lot of fish, a lot of milk-based stuff. Nisua. I made some salmon soup the other night. I found a recipe, and I said to my husband as we sat down to eat, and I took a few mouthfuls, that I felt like I was sitting at that Formica topped counter, Formica top table in the kitchen eating again, because it just took me home. It was a lot of shrimp. My father, before he left, would do shrimp and salt and dill. Finnish food has a lot of dill. And I loved that stuff. I used to sneak it all the time. We'd have like pickled herring, just I used to call it tuli boodle, tulia boodle, and I have no idea how to make it, but it was like farina that was flavored with grape or some type of fruit juice. We'd often have kisila, which is a fruit soup type of thing that is thickened with potato starch and any type of fruit. My mother would put apricots and raisins and prunes and different things, and then we would have it on rice pudua, which is just an unsweetened, just straight from the pot rice pudding, I guess, because you just stand there at the stove and cook and stir it forever, and then you put the gisela on top of it. And I made it for my brother one time when he came here a few years ago, and we were two happy little clams. So when I look back,
So,
when
uh-huh.
so right now, because my mother did it every year, I have to bake pulla for my brother, because she would bake it for him every year for his birthday and mail it to him. And so since she passed away, I've just picked up that little custom, and I bake him we call it more nisua in the States, but the real name is pulla. And it's a sweet Finnish bread with cardamom and eggs and different things. It's not fancy. There's nothing in Finland that's fancy, except for the cakes that they make, and we didn't find that. So I continue that little.
Did you? Did you have a particular festival that you celebrated that you really liked? Something that still touches your heart?
No, we hadn't. They do the typical. They're Lutherans are the state church, so it's the same holidays. Before my father left, we weren't allowed. They would say that Santa had set up the tree, and so we would go to bed on Christmas Eve and then get up to the Christmas tree, because that's how they do it in Finland. But it wasn't any different, really. It wasn't like so we had the typical holidays: Christmas, Easter, and we did Thanksgiving and the things that Americans do. My mother was very intent on us being Americans. And so she wouldn't name us Finnish names, and she'd always get a bit annoyed even when I was an adult, when she would hear that somebody had given their child a Finnish name, because she would say, "We're Americans. We're supposed to be Americans." So she didn't, that was something that was important to her, was to be American.
What was her background? Was she also European?
Yeah, her parents came from Finland. Both of her parents came from Finland. And and they grew up on a farm where there were several other Finnish families. They called it Child's Road over in Pennsylvania, because we were right on the border, and they called it Finn Road because everybody who lived on it was Finnish. So they grew up on a farm, and she said they never noticed the Depression. And I actually did, when I was at grad school, I did an oral narrative on her, and I got a lot of her story. But Mrs. Viitanen, the one whose sauna we used to go to, Mrs. Viitanen, the way they met was that my Bappa is Finnish for grandpa, or grandfather, but his barn burned down, and everyone came together, and that's how they met the Viitanens. And so the Viitanens, Mrs. Viitanen and my mother, became very close. And so Mrs. Viitanen wanted me to call her Mumma. I was very confused as a little girl, because I said, is she my Mumma? And my mother said, not really, but she wants to be. So I also called Mrs. Viitanen Mumma. But I can pick out a Finnish name. And when I watch the Olympics, I scream at the TV because nobody can say them. And my own name, Raevuori means hail or storm on a hill or a mountain. That's what my name translates into.
Wow.
So try to make sense.
Interesting. Yeah.
Try to make sense out of that.
So you mentioned your mother had passed away. Did you ever reconnect with your father at any
No.
point in time?
No. My oldest brother went there after he graduated from college. He saved money, and our father told him to go away and never come back. So he fought for Finland in World War II. And, and Finland aligned itself with Russia aligned itself with Germany because Russia has been throughout history a threat to them. I still have trouble with that, but he, I guess, told stories about sitting on dead Germans, frozen dead Germans, because the Finns didn't like it either, but they'd sit on frozen dead Germans to eat their sea rations. And he was the sole survivor of one battle. He was the only living person. So he either had PTSD to the point that it made him crazy, or he had underlying issues that the PTSD exasperated. And he never learned English, and he was volatile.
Wow.
And it was a good thing that he left, except that I didn't know that in kindergarten. So
wow.
It created a hole in my life that never has, been filled, basically. But as I've aged and, looked at different things, I realized that it was good that he left, and that he was just incapable.
Yeah. How was it good that he left?
How what?
In your mind? How was it good that he left in your mind?
Because the fear left. He was both physically and mentally abusive, and
to your mom,
yeah,
or to your entire family?
To our mother. With us, he I spent my life kind of hiding from him, but he was physically abusive to our mother, and we saw that. I mean, we watched it. It was not a good environment. It was scary, really scary stuff. So so my mother said later that she didn't know what she would do when he left, because all of a sudden there she was with 3 children, and she was working, but she made no money. But then she said she realized on the first day that she made it through the day and we were all still there, and so she just started to make it, take it day by day. And we never heard her say a mean or cruel thing about our father. She never berated him.
Yeah.
And she just didn't complain. So she did the best she could.
Was a pretty incredible woman.
She was.
Yeah.
I mean, she was somebody, she was really smart, but she came from an immigrant family. And when I was in grad school and trying to figure out how in the world to finance it, she told me that when all the Finnish girls went to Cleveland and were maids and governesses, and she was working with a family, and they saw her potential, and they got her into a college and were willing to help, but she had to come up with $250. And she had no one to ask. So, yeah, but she loved
$250 was a lot
yeah,
for me.
yeah, and she loved physics. She loved, yeah, physics of all things. She loved it. So she was a very bright person. So
yeah,
and she
you
was our
take
church.
after her.
Oh yeah, and she was our church organist, and she, she worked at the hospital in administration, and she just did her best. Everybody in the neighborhood thought the world of her, and I know that in the she told me one time, and I put that into my oral narrative, into the introduction, that one of the women at church, Mrs. Christopher, and I knew her daughter Ann, and Ann was in a wheelchair from polio, and she didn't have an easy life, but she walked up to my mother one day probably when I was in high school. I was the youngest, and she told my mother, she said, "Sometimes I feel like I just can't go on, but then I look at you, I think of you, and I can do it." And my mother said, she just stood there and looked at her. She didn't know what to say. And she said to me, she said, why am I anything that she would? She had no clue. She just had no clue what an incredible person she was. So
Sounds like she was very humble.
yeah, and very talented. I have her pine needle baskets that my neighbor, when I was on the Hopi reservation, was an archaeologist, and he said, "Oh my gosh, these are museum quality." And she knitted. Yeah, she knitted, she sewed, she used to tailor everything that she would make for me. She was just amazing. So and always tried to be upbeat, and but she was very, very quiet. She was the typical Finn. So, and Finns are known to be a very quiet people. And
yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about your school and your friends. How big was your class? Was there anything especially exciting for you at school? Any really wonderful experiences or not so wonderful experiences you'd like to share?
School was, I think, pretty typical. It was a small town, and started out and in an elementary, Southeast Elementary, but I was able to start school and graduate with the same people. And my class out of Conneaut High School, I think we had 257. I was a class officer, and I played flute in the band. I guess what strikes me is that there are many of us who have reconnected on Facebook, and we're still teasing and laughing about really stupid things, especially Teresa and I. Yeah. And like Jeff, who went to the Coast Guard Academy, and then he became a teacher. And so, but every day he puts site puzzles on Facebook for us, and a bunch of us sit there and try to, and so we still have some kind of connection. So that's nice. But, we all, I belong to our Luther League at church, and we all went to church and everything because that was the times, and it was a good, wholesome environment. That, I walked everywhere. I guess one of the thing that I still miss so much about Conneaut, One thing was we had the tennis courts right down a block away from my house. There was the Liberty Street tennis courts. And so, but in the winter, they would flood the courts for ice skating. And so everybody came from all over town, and I was down there probably every night between, after supper, probably from 5th grade through my senior year of high school, ice skating. And I have a scar in my eyebrow because we played Capture the Flag and, Red Rover, and, we were totally unsupervised. It was great. And I also, I guess the biggest thing from childhood that has continued through my life, cats, because my brother and I found a kitten the year that the Christmas that my father left. And I've always loved horses. And I think kittens and horses are what carried me through life. And I was able to get a horse for free, and I worked babysitting and everything to support him when I was in high school. But we had Lake Erie, and that beach and the break wall, they're home. There's just something about it. It's why the Finns settled along the lakefront, was that it reminded them of Finland, with the water, and a lot of them though worked at the docks and made their living that way. But the lake was it's like a character in my years growing up that it gave me comfort and fun and friendship. So I lost people in the lake. Lake Erie is the most volatile lake because it's the most shallow lake, and boat accidents and different things. And my brother, they're the Great Lake ore boats, and they bring in ore for the refineries that used to be in Pittsburgh. And so we'd hear the foghorns. They were throughout the town, and we had the lighthouse, and, it's just kind of part of the character and the, when we were in high school, we'd sneak out during pajama parties and walk down and sit on the bluff and solve all the world problems. So it was.
So you started that early.
Yeah. So, it was kind of an idyllic setting. Now it's full of drugs, and the town is pretty well dead. But at the time, it was a wonderful place, and of course everybody knew you, so you couldn't get away with anything.
Yeah. Well, tell me about your college experience.
Well, I started out at
finish.
I started out at Suomi College up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where we got 310 inches of snow. And the Finnish population founded that. And I had aunts and cousins who had gone. And I knew when I started college, I knew in high school that I wasn't college material. I had nobody ever said a word to me. And I knew that I wasn't my two older brothers. They were both superstars. And I was the girl. And so I never received any encouragement from anybody. And so then I had to figure out something to do. And Suomi didn't require that you'd taken the ACT, that you could take it when you got there. So I got admitted, and I went up and almost flunked out because I was very lost. But then I started getting it together. And it was a junior college. And so then I finally decided that I was going to be an elementary teacher. And so then I transferred to Kent State in Ohio. And I signed up for all the teaching things. And then my aunt, who had been an elementary art teacher, came down and told me, don't be an elementary teacher. Else it could be. And it was the first piece of advice that I had ever gotten in my life. And so I had no idea what to do, and so I quit. And I was also going heavily into debt, with the student loans and things. So anyway, I quit, and I sat at home and tried to figure out what to do and what I should major in. And then a brochure came from the Army. And
Brochure.
a brochure from the Army, and there's a young woman with a pot hat on holding a 35 millimeter camera. And I joined the Army and became a photographer.
You did?
Yeah.
So what year did you join?
74. My oldest brother had been a conscientious objector. And then when Vietnam ended, and he had done all the requirements, and he had graduated from college. He joined the Army, and so I thought, well, if Andy's in, can't be that bad, because he was actually in Korea, and he had his own TV show. He was a sportscaster.
Wow.
And so I thought, that looks pretty good. And then when he heard in a letter that I had enlisted, he called home and he said, I wish you had talked to me first. And that was the first bit of fear. And, but it was too late. I had already gotten in on delayed. And so there I was, because I was pretty lost, and all my friends were in college. I didn't have any friends left at home anymore. And I didn't know what to do with myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I joined the Army because it offered a salary.
Yeah. And how was basic training for you?
Basic training was actually, I've always been somebody who enjoys walking and running. I used to run. I was an awful runner, but basic training was easy. And I had a very, very fair drill sergeant, Sergeant Barker. And I was selected for the honor of raising the flag on Fort McClellan. And and then I ended up that in order to do this honor, I had to get up at 4 a.m. I was like,
wow.
This isn't that great. But yeah, she was very fair, and the classes were really easy. And the physical fitness part was easy. I had fun climbing, making it over the wall. I thought crawling under bar, it was just kind of like, oh my gosh, we're in the Army. I found out that M16s were kind of fun to shoot, or fire.
Yeah.
So I was very annoyed with the gas chamber because they tricked us into talking and inhaling, but, got over that. But yeah, basic training was, we all bonded very quickly. We did have a couple people who got kicked out because of inappropriate behavior and mental issues. And that was, the people there were so different. My bunkmate, who ended up being my bunkmate, we were on the same trip down from Cleveland together, and she and her friend came in to the recruiting office totally drunk and ripped on some kind of drugs. And I sat there, here I am, as people have often said, the little Lutheran girl. looking at them, her name was Kathryn Sammy. I still remember that. And I didn't know, I just kind of pretended she wasn't there. And of course, she ended up becoming my bunkmate because of our names. Her name was right next to my name. And we learned how to get along.
Okay.
And of course, she couldn't do drugs and drink and basic training. So, so it was a real introduction to a whole different type of people for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was a bit of
expanded your world.
Yeah, it expanded my world. I mean, in college, of course, people were doing LSD and drinking like crazy, but I just, my students, when I became a teacher, would say, Miss Raevuori, have you ever done drugs? And I'd say, you know what, you guys, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was around it. Of course, I'm going to try something, but I guess the truth is I was too cheap. I didn't have any money, and I wasn't going to waste my money on stuff like that. So they found that hysterically funny. But I was never curious, and it just wasn't me. But
so not even weed.
Pardon?
Not even weed.
No, yeah, I did. I tried it, but I didn't like it. It's like, yuck. I don't know. I just didn't like it. So
that's good.
So it was just never, and all of my friends smoked like crazy at times, but I was the one that, especially one of the girls in the dorm at Suomi, when she was tripping on LSD, would knock on my door and come in and say, "Hi, I'm high. I want to talk with you." And she would but they all felt safe with me for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't know what that was about still, but
yeah,
it was their life. And so she would count everything that I owned, and I do all kinds of silly, weird things, and then go back to her room.
So, what were the highlights of being in the Army for you?
Learning about photography. I did school, when we learned about, we had to learn all about the chemical elements of film, and we had to learn the mechanical and the exposures and how to freeze action, we learned a lot about taking pictures. And and they would take us different places just to practice photography. And so they'd put us on a bus, and there we were in our little green Army uniforms, and they'd take us to downtown Red Bank, New Jersey. One time they took us to a New York City mall, and they'd set us loose, and they'd say, "Go take pictures," and specify the types of film and whatever. And so we'd walk around those towns and walk into shops and talk to people, and it was ridiculous fun. If somebody would see some really good-looking guys, they'd come run and tell us, the other women, and we call each other girls then, and we'd go and I'd say, "Can I take your picture?" And because we were in uniform and we're carrying cameras, we could ask anything, and people would let us take pictures of all kinds of things, and it was just ridiculous fun. And I also loved learning how to process film. Processing isn't all that much fun, but it took a certain, it took a lot of practice. But I loved working in the dark room. Absolutely loved working in the dark room. And I loved cropping. I loved learning the exposures, because if we messed up film, we could fix it in the dark room. And it was just
Huh.
fun and interesting. And it,
Was it because you got to see what the fruits of your labor
yeah,
were,
it was a pretty quick
essentially?
turnaround. Yeah, and we learned, I
Uh,
mean, I'm still, when I'm looking at Facebook, I'm always looking at people's pictures and critiquing them, in my mind, kind of like what I do when I walk
mhm.
around and read, or when I read their posts or hear them speaking. I'm always editing them and correcting their English and grammar. But yeah, it was just a fun, I guess, artistic thing. We also did learn to do aerial photography, and they took us up in helicopters and strapped us into the Hueys, and we sat out on the skids in the doorway and hung out and did aerial shots and learned about doing maps and something none of us really quite understood, but we kind of pretended that we did. But so,
Which
yeah. So
the
we
mapping or else?
pardon? Mapping. Yeah, we didn't
Was
know
that
how
the
to map. We
I
supposedly
see.
learned infrared photography for night photography, but we didn't, and
Mhm.
we were supposed, it came up on MOS tests about the chemical aspect of infrared film, like any of us knew really any of that. But it was fun, really fun stuff
Yeah.
to learn. And we had tests all the time, and I guess we did what everybody else did during AIT, but we had a great fun class, and
Uh-huh.
so that part was good.
Now, how many years were you on active duty?
I was only active duty for 3 years.
3 years.
Mhm.
Okay.
And then
And
I married a guy, and then so the total time I was on basis and moving around with the Army was 12 years. So
oh, okay. So he was active duty.
yeah, he stayed active duty.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I know something happened that was very disturbing for you when you
Mhm.
were on active duty. Can you share with us what that
Yeah, it was when
is?
I was at AIT at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and I was raped, and it was a fellow classmate and a friend of his, and it messed me up. And
I'm so sorry.
yeah, so
That's horrible.
I thought, I mean, that was, my whole naivety. However, I'm not going to be, but
Naivete.
naivete, and I thought that the guys who I met when I was in the Army, were the same like the guys that I went to Suwannee College with, and we were all friends, and we all hung out with each other in each other's rooms or whatever, and we all went to different places together, and we were fun. And so that was my life
Uh-huh.
experience. And it was the same with high school in my little town, is that, we were all friends, and it was always, they were safe places. And of course, I
Did
blamed
you
myself
report?
and
Yeah.
continued to blame myself. And of course, I never said a word. And I guess that is my issue with the armed forces. I know they're making it more vocal now, but I know that they knew it was happening, and they had
Yeah.
no avenues to report, no encouragement, no nothing. It was, and I know that it happened in basic training too, and other platoons. I know it happened there. And and at the time I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I'm not in that platoon. But that was when I was at AIT at Fort Monmouth, and it was life before and life after. So
Right.
the way that and then actually the year afterwards, I was suicidal, and I was sent to Germany. Of course, when I signed up for the Army, they told me I was going to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And I was like, oh, great. But they never gave me any paperwork or anything. They just told me I was going there. And I ended up in Germany. And I ended up in a company that was 69 Signal Company in Kaiserslautern. And the temporary duty, and all the photographers were based, the slots were based on going out into the field and taking pictures. And the TDY funds had been cut, and so we didn't have a job. So I ended up down in the lab. I had a friend down there named Lillian, and she worked in the lab, and I would just go down there and print pictures with her, and I had to do something. But that cadre in that company, I don't remember what happened. I was probably too young and too flip and bored out of my mind, and they hated me. And so the EER that they wrote for me at the end of that year, or about a year, they you're supposed to ace. If you get less than 120 out of 125, you're in trouble. And they did an EER on me that said, my rating was 25. And
it was 25.
Yeah.
125.
Not 125, it was 25. And they told me that my problem was that I made the mistake, like when we would do PT together in formation, like it would start out with some of the cadres saying, let's go ahead and run. And so we would leave and run together for a while, and then it would turn into some of the guys saying, let's go. And so when it turned up that I could outrun every man in the company, regardless of rank. I could outrun them. I could leave them in the dust.
Wow.
And they gave me a 0 on physical fitness, and said it was because I was a female and couldn't do things. Yeah. And as far as, me going down to the lab, we literally just hung out they called it the photographer's bullpen, 8 hours a day, doing nothing. So I'd go down and help Lillian print, and they'd say, well, you go down to the print lab. You don't show any interest in your own MOS. It was just, and so then they got rid of me by sending me up to Heidelberg, and it was a detachment, and it was the best thing they ever did. I ended up loving that job. I ran the black and white processing.
Feel like, what do you feel like they hated you? Were they jealous of you?
I don't, I look back now. And I don't know. I don't know. One time, one time there, the women, we all lived together up in the dorm in the barracks, and whenever we'd walk around together, and it was artillery, and it was the Army, and guys would hang out of the barrack windows screaming, "Hey, baby, you're great, I'd like to fuck you," and hey, baby, how about coming up here? I could give you a job. And it was just disgusting. And so we sat down and we asked for a meeting with the first sergeant and our company commander. that we had something that we would like to discuss. And we walk in there and everybody shut up and they all looked at me. And so I told them what was bothering us, and I was nervous as anything. And I just said, we can't go anywhere. We can't go. I mean, I walked into the dining hall one time and I was the only female there. And so there were about 200 men in there, and I picked up my tray with my food, and I was standing there looking around and thinking, okay, where am I going to sit? And some guy yells so that everybody in the whole place heard him, "Hey, baby, you can come over here and sit on my face." And so I took my tray over and dropped it off and walked out. And, it was just, it was awful. And so there's this, after I listed several of the things that we didn't know what to do with, it was dead quiet in there, and the company commander sitting there staring at us from his desk, and First Sergeant Cecilia, standing there staring at us, dead quiet. And finally, First Sergeant said, "Well, you know what I think?" I'm like, "What? What do you think?" And he looked at Sergeant Tiggs, or whatever his name was, Captain Tiggs, that was his name. And he said, "I think you guys like it." And we just stood there looking at him. "Yeah, we think you like it, that you like the attention, and that you just came in here to get more attention." So, yeah. And so it was an impossible. So we had a little attachment that was part of 69th Signal up in Heidelberg, which was about an hour and a half away. And people were processing out to go back to the States, and they needed a photographer. So they called me in one day, and I know it was to get rid of me, and they sent me up there. They said, "You don't show any interest. You're not a good soldier. We're sending you up there." So I went up there, and there was a Sergeant First Class Hammond, was the NCIO, NCIOS, NCI. And anyway, he was the one in charge. We didn't have any officers there except for in another building. And I actually had a job. I did the black and white processing. My main job was photography. So I ran around with my camera to the different award ceremonies. I met all the generals. I ended up with a letter of appreciation from the 4-star General Commander-in-Chief of the European Army and European Army, General Blanchard wrote me a letter of appreciation, and I got an ARCOM, and Sergeant Hammond, when I got a 125 EER, I said, "Okay, I'm confused." And he looked at me and he said, you're incredible." And he said, "The thing I like about you is," he said, "one of the things I especially like about you is that when you mess up, you don't hide it. You come out and you say, 'I messed up. What do we do?'" I'm like, "Well, but he thought that I hung the moon. And, but also the whole time that all this good stuff at work was going on, what I was trying to do, because I grew up Lutheran, 2 days before I was raped, I went and talked to the chaplain, because I was basically, I told him, "I don't know about this whole Army thing. This is not quite what I thought I was signing up for." And so he told me I was where God wanted me to be, and that, this is where I'm supposed to be, and that God is taking care of me. And then 2 days later, I got raped. And I just went on a free fall. And so by the time I hit I'd also been, when I got to Heidelberg, I was walking back to work after lunch, and there was this little garden plots area where we worked through. And an American GI attacked me. He did not cut me. He grabbed me, and he had a knife. And I thought he was going to kill me. I can still see what I envisioned then. I mean, it wasn't anything. I could see my guts spilling out onto the ground and me falling down. And that was the first time that night I was late. Some guy had asked me out, and it was some Jesus freak guy. And I ended up standing him up because I was at the Army police. I broke away from this guy and I ran to the MP shack. And anyway, but I had done a few things, and I did want to die. And then that night I went out. He came back. I was late getting back, and anyway, I got into the whole Jesus movement thing because I was afraid God was going to kill me. And I spent the next how many years trying to make it up to God that I was raped. It makes a whole lot of sense, but it also explained everything. It explained my brain tumor that almost killed me. It explained, I look back now and I think, but for 20 years, it explained everything to me. It explained my brain tumor. It explained my inability to have children. It explained my ex-husband cheating on me. It explained all of the trauma then that happened for those next many years. It explained when I was doing my student teaching, Albuquerque Public Schools, cutting back on English teachers, and it explained the day that I had the interview with the graduate program that I was supposed to be in a shoo-in for. Some girl in my student teaching class who was known to use cocaine and it was in a bad part of town anyway, threatening to kill me, who sat after the regular teacher left and said, "I am going to kill you," because she had lunchtime detention. I can't remember everything, but I am going to kill you. And then I had to leave and go to that interview, and I didn't want to make excuses, but I was probably still physically shaking then. And they thought that in spite of all of the recommendations, and I didn't know anybody on that board, they thought I was too nervous to make it through the program. And they made me first alternate instead. So that it explained everything to me, and I was able to get the job out on Hopi, which was...
You alluded earlier to before the rape and after the rape kind of being two different people. And now you're talking about a lot of things that you say were explained by that. Do you still feel that all of these bad things were explicable by the rape, or have you been able to see it differently and realize that these did not happen as a result of you being raped, that you were not responsible for that?
Yeah. I mean, when I got divorced and I left, it took a while to extricate myself from that whole fundamentalist thing. But it all, when I was out on, I ended up teaching out on the Hopi Reservation, and there were 35 of us teachers, and we all lived and worked together, and we drove 120 miles one way for our groceries. So it was kind of an exile, but that was when I started getting the physical sensations of flashbacks when I was out there. But Yeah, I mean, that was 20 years later, and then I found out that that's fairly typical. But when I started counseling is when I started being able to pull all this stuff apart and realize that none of it made any sense, the way that my mind had changed and the fear that I basically lived with, and that none of it made any sense. It was life, basically, that I did have a few extra things thrown in that not a lot of people, that don't happen to the general population. There were a lot of things, but yeah, I've pretty
Like the
well,
brain tumor
yeah, like a brain
you were
tumor,
talking about.
like going into
When did
third. Pardon?
When did the brain tumor occur?
That was when I was at Fort Bliss. I went to Fort Bliss when that was my ex-husband's next assignment, and
I see.
and I went into. I mean, it was a weird one. They said in neurosurgery that they had people there feeling my head because they could feel it on the outside, and it ate my skull and then broke into my brain. And
Wow.
and the only reason, I mean, one day my husband left, and he reached down, and I brushed the back of my head on an overstuffed chair, and I almost threw up. And I could kind of feel it back there. And I made an appointment. And then I thought, oh, this is stupid, and I canceled it.
Uh-huh.
And one of the women out at where I kept my horse was married to a doctor, and she had been a nurse in neurosurgery. And I said a couple weeks later, "Hey, Marie, what the heck is this?" And she felt my head, and she turned pale, and she said, "I don't know, but you need to see somebody right now." And so I ended up going into surgery with a 50-50 chance. But I also bounced out of it. I was supposed to be in intensive care for at least a week. But there I was. I think I was 25. And I bounced out of it. Yeah, I bounced out of it like everybody was shocked the way that I bounced out of it. Not to say that I didn't have some after effects, but I ended up back on the floor that evening, and instead of going into intensive care. And they ended up letting me go home against hospital. He's still there, it says reconnecting. Against hospital rules, they let me go home with my head was all still stitched up, and it was not pretty, and they let me go home because they said it wasn't serving any purpose to have me there, that I could go in and get checked, and I could go in and get the sutures out, but I was pacing the hallways and walking nonstop. And then that last day, when my neurosurgeon came up, I was waiting for him, and he saw me peeking out of the door, and then I ran back and jumped into bed, and he was laughing when he came in. He's like, this is stupid. Why don't we send you home? So they did.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. So yeah, and they followed me for 30 years, with questionnaires asking about everything, because there was the type of tumor I had was one that could recur. But after 30 years, they decided that it wasn't going to, and so I don't get those anymore.
Okay. And where were you stationed besides Fort McClellan and in Germany?
Let's see, Fort McClellan, and then I went to Fort Monmouth, and then I went to Kaiserslautern in Germany, and then I went to Heidelberg. So that was when I was active duty. Afterwards, it was Fort Bliss, and then back to Heidelberg,
Okay.
and then to Fort Gillum, Georgia.
Were those your first husband's duty
Yeah,
stations
those
or
were
your
my
own
first
duty
husband's
stations?
duty. Yeah, those were his duty stations afterwards.
After the Heidelberg
Yeah, after
stint that you
Heidelberg.
were on.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
after Heidelberg, that
And
was.
Fort McClellan,
Hmm,
yeah, I
your
believe
question.
Fort McClellan is a closed base. Is that correct for
Yeah,
contamination?
yeah. It
Okay.
closed.
Are you on the
Am I on what?
are, are you on the PACT Act registry for the contaminated bases or
Not
not?
that I know of. Hmm.
Okay, that's something that you can sign up for. It was passed during the Biden administration. It's a new act for soldiers that have been on contaminated bases, such as Camp Lejeune. That's one of them.
Hmm.
But there are several listed, and one is Fort McClellan. So that's something that I would suggest you look into.
Okay.
Um, Aside from the rape, which I believe is listed as military sex trauma for
Hmm.
you, are you service connected for any other issues?
No, no, which
No.
is kind of silly because, I mean, when I look at that tumor in my skull, they said that had been
Yeah.
there, yeah, for a while, that it had taken a while to get as big as it was. So it probably started in the Army.
Uh huh.
Um,
Quite possible.
yeah, but
Sounds
there's
like.
no way to
Yeah.
prove that. But they said it wasn't new.
Yeah. So, what sorts of symptoms besides the suicidality did did you have, and maybe an acute awareness of your surroundings? What other things did the rape and military sex trauma did it bring on for you?
Oh, it brought on. I mean, I hid it. I never told anyone, and
Mm-hmm.
it brought out things that. I mean, I knew I was worthless, and I became rather promiscuous because what difference did it make? And it there was also an anger in me that I didn't understand any of it. I knew it was my fault, because I guess that's also a typical response is that everybody blames themselves. I think the
Mm-hmm.
whole worthless thing was like my ex-husband, and it's taken me even years. I never liked him. I never
Okay.
I never had any kind of respect for him.
Uh-huh.
But he was, as the chaplain said, he's a good Christian young man. And, and, and he had a sex addiction. And it was,
Uh-huh.
it was just things that I knew that I wasn't worth anything. And so I dealt with what was given me. I never thought that I
Mm.
deserved anything better. And I do remember saying to my first counselor when he told me that he wanted me to apply for disability, and I said, because by that point I had a master's from Middlebury College, and I said, I think I've
Mm-hmm.
done pretty well for myself. And, and he let that
Mm-hmm.
sit in the air, and he said, what would have you done? And when I went back to school, it was to keep myself alive. I didn't know how to support myself. I knew that I needed, and that I knew I could do it with teaching. I did my BA at UT El Paso, but I knew that I couldn't get a job that I could support myself with just a bachelor's in English. And so anyway, it was, I knew I had to get school in order to support myself and to continue. And Mike, my counselor, let me sit there for a couple seconds, and then he said, not quietly, not anything, he just said, what could have you done if you weren't raped?
Huh. And what was your answer to that?
I didn't have one. I mean, when I went into the Army, I wanted to be able to pay for my education so that I could become a veterinarian. That was my goal when I went into the Army.
Uh-huh.
And, but that just, everything kind of just went up in a poof when it was happening. When it was happening, everything changed. So that, I don't know, when you feel worthless, you don't feel like you're going to be able to go into a class and learn advanced biology.
Have you reclaimed your self-worth?
I'm not sure.
Have you been able to do that? You're not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have. I know that I'm a worthwhile person, and I know that overall I have some good friends. I know that I made some big mistakes when I was teaching with some of my students, but I also know that for a lot more students.
Also?
Pardon? Yeah, I know that for a lot more students. Like one.
How did you make mistakes?
One girl who kept challenging me, telling me that anything that I said about literature or writing, she would say, that's just your opinion. And so I was very hard on her with her first essay because she was a decent writer and it was a decent essay, but she was so sure of herself that I knocked her down a few pegs, and she was furious and she hated me for the rest of her high school years. But, and I felt, I thought as I did that, I thought, I don't think I should do this, but I was sick of hearing her, and so I did that. Somebody else, one of the girls that she turned in an essay that, when I looked at it, I don't know, it was about the Schwann delivery truck. And it was such an odd essay. And I gave her like a C+ for reasons I can't remember. And I heard at the end of the year from her stepmother. And then she disappeared from school. And she was a bright young woman, but she wouldn't talk to me hardly at all. And it ended up that she was pregnant. That she was not going to keep the baby, and I didn't know any of this as it was going on. And I ended up helping her graduate because she had missed so much school. But, then I thought, when I rethought that essay, I thought, it just didn't, I should have been more encouraging. So those are the two big things that, that stick out to me. Otherwise,
I'm assuming it's your GI Bill to complete your college education.
I did my bachelor's with that. Everything else I was on my own. I went,
I see.
Yeah. So everything else I was on my own.
I know you've done several things to help cope with the PTSD and the military sex trauma. Can you tell us a little bit about what those things are that have helped you and what you're currently doing with your writing group?
Well, I mean, therapy. I went to, it was the vet center in Albuquerque where I started. And of course,
Uh-huh.
I didn't even get into my father
Where
and the
you
whole
first?
horse thing. But where I first started, and the reason I started, I never had any thought, was because on 2020, when they do those stories, they had a young woman from the military who had been raped, and she turned into a megaphone, and they interviewed her on TV, and then at the end they had a number, and they said, if you have experienced this, call this number. So I called the number,
Uh-huh.
and a man answered the phone, and I tried to talk, and I
Uh-huh.
couldn't, and so I hung up.
Okay.
And I paced and paced and paced, and then I picked up the phone, and I collapsed onto my kitchen floor, and my cat came and sat with me. And I called again, and another man, the same man, answered, and I couldn't talk. And he said, "Did you call before?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Would you talk to a woman?" And I said, "I'll try." And so Annie and I sat there and cried together. And he found somebody, and he said, or somebody I ended up talking with asked me if I would be willing to try counseling. And I said, "What good is it going to do after all these years?" And she said,
Uh-huh.
"Can you try?" And so that's
Uh-huh.
how I started with the counseling. I finally said, I think I didn't want to disappoint them, that they were trying to do a job, and comes from being a teacher. You always want to help people succeed in their job. And so I
Sure.
said, "Yes, I will." And so then they called me from the vet center. And the first night that I went there was a group of men in the waiting room, and they said, "Hi." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I don't want to see you people." And they said, "Who are you here
Right.
for?" And I said, "Mike." And they said, "Yeah, we have Mike for group." So I turned around and left. And then about an hour later, Mike called me, and he said, "No, they didn't have me for group. They had so-and-so, but they didn't know that." And so anyway, it was a bumpy start. And then I started with the VA
Yeah.
trauma classes there in Albuquerque. And then when I went to New Hampshire, I contacted the vet center. Oh my gosh. I had a counselor at the vet center who would sit there and just talk, and she'd tell me about her other clients.
Oh, okay. So this was pre-HIPAA or post?
This was after Albuquerque. This was after I had some decent counseling, and then
Okay.
then she started a group, and I said, "Okay, I'll come to the group." But then I ended up running the group.
Uh-huh.
And she told me that on the weeks that I didn't show up, she says, "The group doesn't work without you." It was just another, like, this isn't how it's supposed to be. So then we came down here, and then I got in touch with the VA, and I had a couple really good counselors there. And then I
Yeah.
needed a break. I tried another session about a year ago, but it was a workbook thing, and it didn't do much. But I still have major depression problems, still major self, whatever. My brain can tell me that I've made it through times when most people would have folded.
Yeah.
But
Are you suicidal at all?
what?
Are you still suicidal at all?
No. That
Good.
I was when I was out on Hopi. I was when I got back to Albuquerque and I was teaching. But I learned coping mechanisms when I was in counseling. And no, I can't. I mean, there are times when I think when I remember those times, but I just can't go there anymore. It was not a good time in life. But I did. I kept.
Would your best?
What was my best? What?
Go ahead. I was going to ask you, what would your best advice be that you would give other young women who are considering going into different branches of the service?
I had a hard time with that when I was teaching.
Okay.
But I hadn't dealt with my own. But I would be very truthful. I would say, because in my women's writing group, there are younger people there, and it hasn't changed that much.
Right.
Yeah. I would say watch your back. Don't be naive. It doesn't matter what a good friend you think somebody is. Don't go outnumbered. I think I could have handled it if it was just one. Oh, who knows? I mean, that's still the guilt speaking. But our physical strength is not the same. And if you think it is, don't be stupid. I did end up working with men who were good, decent people in the military, but it took me until I came here to Asheville that I learned to start handling, and going to that Tai Chi class that you told me about. Sometime once or twice I was. Pardon?
Yeah. Dr. Justin, I'm trying to remember his last name. Is he still teaching Tai Chi?
No, this was the guy who came in and he was trying to get the VA to hire him.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I remember him. It was
Yeah,
great.
and something came in about checking in, and I said it's hard. And and he said, what's difficult, when we were sitting there, and I said, it's hard for me to be with XGIs, and I'm the only woman. And a few of the guys took great. I know they felt insulted, and they said, why? That doesn't make any, we're safe. And the teacher said, wait a minute, guys, she comes from her own place or something. And he didn't push it, and I didn't want to say anything more. I mean, just saying that felt like I was treading on, that I was putting myself in danger, basically. But being at this VA and being there and then going to a couple of the classes that your former boss taught and being in with a mixture of people is what helped get me away from that, but right now when my senior girls would go in, I just said, well, I didn't say much because I didn't know how to deal with it then. On the flip side, I was able to tell some of the boys, I remember one of them, I had this class of jocks and they were seniors and nobody could believe I had all these boys together, and they came in just hardly able to stand up. And Justin walked over to me and said, Miss Raevuori, my former girlfriend is a stripper. And I said, what? Yeah, we found out that such and such, and they were all and I said, Justin, wait. And he stood there and he said, what? And I said, what was she like when you were with her? Oh, she was nice. She was, she was conservative. She never swore. I mean, she was a nice girl, and she's a stripper now. And I said, Justin, I said, something happened to her.
Yeah.
And he said, what? And I said, something bad happened to her. And it was like I hit him. And the smile went off of his face. And he walked over and he was quiet for the whole class. So there were times that I was
Yeah.
able to say things to the boys to make them realize that girls aren't there for their fun.
Right.
Yeah.
And you did allude to promiscuity, which is often
Yeah.
one place that people go to when they've been sexually
Yeah.
assaulted. The key to dealing with it is getting to a point where you can reclaim your own sexuality and no one can take it from you.
It wasn't like that for me. It was a numbness, and it didn't matter that I was already ruined. So what difference did it make?
Oh,
Yeah, it was not good. I mean, it was not any kind of reclamation. It was a total adding to the proof that I was worthless. So
yeah.
that's how it worked for me.
And I feel like I had gotten to know you quite well. And one thing I would say you're not, and that is worthless.
Thank
You're
you.
absolutely worth everything. Yeah,
Yeah.
you really are. You're a treasure.
Yeah.
So, I just wanted to cover kind of the rest of the interview. We did bounce around a little bit. Oh, before
Yeah.
that, you had said you weren't able to have children. Was that during your first marriage that you were trying,
Right.
or
Yes.
both marriages?
Yes. That was during my first marriage. And I went through so many tests, and I went through a major surgery that really messed me up, that I still pay for to this day. And they just said, well, we don't know why you can't get pregnant, but it's not going to happen. So.
And were you treated at the Army hospitals that your
Yeah.
husband was
Yeah, I was treated
stationed
at,
at base?
I was treated at Army hospitals.
Mm.
So it was not
Sorry that didn't work out.
yeah. With this administration, this is the first time I'm saying I'm glad I don't have kids now. But
Yeah.
they would
Totally
be
get it.
off and on their own, but I don't know. This is, in some ways, it's a sigh of relief that didn't happen. But I think that I'm also stuck on knowing them as children and as high school kids. I think that, that's where I still see them. But yeah, I went through, I never really, I didn't let it stop me from living. It was a lot to deal with, but then I never talked with it. And my ex-husband, when I would try to talk about it, he would say, well, if you can't have kids, you can't have kids. And then he'd walk away. So I never had any kind of anything about that, but it just never happened. I tried. I jumped through all the hoops. I went through more physical pain and butchery surgery that didn't do anything except cause me to have more minor surgery. But yeah, it was not a good experience. And now I just recognize it as, in some ways I see it as the whole patriarchy, and that wasn't really a problem for them, and that I was just inferior or something because it was all military hospitals. So even when I was in the Army, it was, I was misdiagnosed and given medications that I couldn't take, and people, when I vomited and threw up and I said, I can't take this, I had one doctor rip up the notepad, slam it on the desk and say, if you're not going to try, I'm not going to help. It's just, the military is not, just when I think of the series of events, different places, different whatever, it's not woman friendly.
Yeah.
Well, what else would you like to add for future generations or for any other woman who has served and who's had a rape that they've had to deal with, or women who've been gang raped
Yeah.
and are too afraid to report?
Don't give up. I mean, when I find something you love, and at this point of life right now, I mean, I kind of look around, and I started horses when I was young, and I started out no money and falling off bareback ponies and laughing and getting up, and then when I was actually a part of the military and stuff, and I started learning how to ride correctly. I had friends and things, but who had horses when I was in high school and stuff, and that's where I started learning about sport horses. But I'm riding here again because one of the instructors I knew up in New Hampshire is here, and she's not an instructor anymore, but she's letting me ride their horses. And so I have gone from starting out with an old horse trader and falling off and not knowing that riding lessons existed to about 2 or 3 months ago. Andrea imported a horse from Germany, and he's Grand Prix, both in dressage and jumping. And I walked in, and they have him in the cross ties, and I looked stupid, and they said, "Doc threw a shoe, you're riding Escondo today." And they put me up on this Grand Prix horse, and I stayed on. But I mean, I didn't do any, but they trusted my riding abilities enough, to know that I'm not going to do anything stupid. And this horse, I know that you're not a rider, and I know, but when you get on a beginner horse, they're safe and they have easygoing gaits and stuff. And as you learn to ride, you move up. And this horse is so powerful that when I yelled to Gail, because she was there too. She was my main instructor up in New Hampshire, and she and Andrea are best friends. And I yelled, "I'm not going to try to sit his trot." And then I decided, I'm going to try to sit his trot. I couldn't sit his trot. It was just, he threw me out of the saddle with every stride. But, I couldn't give up on the horses and cats. And then writing. My writing, when I have a love for language, and you have to be open to love and being able, when I tried the religious stuff, all it did was make me realize that I wasn't loving, that I deserved the punishment that I was getting throughout life. Because I had sinned. And so, yeah. And so now that I've gotten away from that, I realize that, there is the God out there that I grew up with who loved me. And, but I haven't ever been able to really go back to church. But it's the whole thing with being, making yourself care and finding something that, I'm not sure. I love to hear the liturgy. When I do go, the liturgy will always be there, and it connects me to my mother, because I grew up listening to her on the organ and me jumping a mile every mistake she made.
She teach you how to play the organ?
No, we had a piano at home, and we would sit and play, and I learned little bits of the piano, and then that was the other thing, music. And I played a flute in band and stuff, and I learned. And music is also a great escape. So right now I have a flute, and in the summers, I go out on the deck sometimes and play it. but even with the windows closed, the kitties cry
Mm.
because it hurts their ears.
And how long have you and Steve been married?
Well, I don't know if you know the story behind that. Steve and
No,
I
was
were
going to ask you about that.
Steve and I were first boyfriend and girlfriend in 9th grade for each of us. The way that I met Steve, I should send you some of my writing, but was that
Okay.
the first horse I ever met in life ended up living across the street from me in a regular neighborhood, but they lived on the edge. And Mr. Horton made a little barn for Linda down in the bottom, and all of a sudden a horse showed up there, and his name was Topper. So I spent from 2nd grade on running down to see Topper, giving him grass through the windows. Every once in a while, Linda would let me ride him, and she'd lead me. But then she went off to college and Topper disappeared. And Steve's family moved into Conneaut, and his father opened a company there called Emco Wheaton, and he was the CEO or whatever. And they built a farm out near a covered bridge that was stunning. And a girl said to me one day, "You want to go horseback riding with me?" And I said, "Where?" And she said, "Well, Steve Wilson has this horse named Topper." They had bought Topper. And so I met Steve there, and we went to high school together, but I was the class officer bando, and he was the guy out behind the gym smoking. And anyway, then we graduated from high school and went on our way, and we had broken up. I mean, we ran with different crowds and whatever. But then when I was in Albuquerque, and all of a sudden I get this email from Cindy English, who we went to high school with, and Cindy and I had been kind of in touch, and she said, "I got an email from Steve Wilson, and he'd just like to know where you are." And I'm like, "Oh, that's fine." And here we are. We've been married now for 20 years.
Wow. That's great.
So I left New Mexico to go up to New Hampshire because that's where he was. And it hasn't been easy. We're still that different. We are still that different. But he's overall a pretty good guy. And he has now turned into a cat person. And,
Good for you.
I mean, Crash is right here. And Steve is the one who rescued Crash, and Peaky over there was living in a truck, and she was totally feral. And he insisted on us trapping her. So we have our moment. But that's how we met. We met in Conneaut. And my attraction to him at the time was I knew him before all this happened, and that was not good because I'm not that person anymore, and I wasn't the person I was in high school 2 months after I graduated from high school. But the whole Conneaut connection and being able to go home with him and go to the covered bridges and, all these different places, there's a certain comfort in that. Because one of the things that I wrote about earlier was that this whole thing never let me go home because I had always planned to go back to Conneaut. It's just glad now that I didn't. So.
Right. Well, lastly, I want to ask how you and Steve have been coping since this apocalyptic Hurricane Helene or Helena.
Helene, good old Helene. We're just a couple miles away from the national news, so our neighborhood got hit. And we had landslides off of our property. We lost part of our property. And we're still trying. FEMA's been here. FEMA has been as good as any government agency can be, but it's long and involved and trying to get people because everybody there were over 1,500 landslides in this area that have to be addressed. So we have had a geoengineer, and he has created a plan for a retaining wall. But when we got the plan, Steve realized that there was only a foot between the driveway and the cliff, and we need to put in more of a buffer. Yeah, because we need to put in a fence and not feel like I get really queasy still when I go out there. So he's working on that again. Our water pipes are still exposed, and it's just been so hard. And we have someone finally. We had people before, but nobody shows up. Everybody gets different jobs, and they're all out. So Steve was able to go down the cliff a little bit, make somewhere to stand, and he encased our water pipes in some type of insulation, and within the insulation, he ran a heating wire. And so we've had our water, but if we have a power outage, we're screwed, because the well will go out and then the pipes will freeze regardless. But, anyway, we're hoping. The guy is saying he's going to be showing up with the trench digger and stuff. So, yeah, it's not over. It's definitely not over. It's people around are still down in Batcave. And for me, I'm homesick. When I go down for I dock, I used to go through Batcave and Lake Lure, and that's gone. And so now I have to go out on the interstate, and it's ugly, and I hate it. And then to go to the VA now, I used to go through Batcave and Girton and Fairview. And, we have been able to get down there a couple times. They have hire a police cop for about the month after we had to go through police checkpoints to our house. But
Wow.
they're still down a little bit, 64, where there was so much looting. And like our neighbor's house, they're back in it now. I mean, it was horrible. And so, it was just kind of my little area on the way to the VA. Now it takes me half an hour. It's just my little routines that have been in place since 2007. But it's not like, we're not out living in tents still, and there are people still living in tents. And our neighbor ended up, organization gave him a tiny house until they could get back into the house. I mean, the help, FEMA can't do everything. And the help here, it was to see the people who showed up, and they'd show up with pallets and pallets of water. They showed up with gas for generators. A guy I was with and didn't know very well contacted me through Facebook, and he tried to send me a generator, but it got stuck somewhere and they couldn't get it here. But the kindness of people in our neighborhood getting together, it was just, it was something that you would never experience without the disaster. So, and everybody screaming about FEMA. It's a government agency, and I guess working for the government helps me understand that, this isn't a magic wand. They're going to do what they can, but we are on our own for finding, the contractors and stuff. So I have suggested a few times, when there's not a natural disaster, for FEMA to be totally absorbed with, maybe they could go out and look for contractors. How they would do that is beyond me, but so if that gets farmed out to the state, people are going to be screwed.
Yeah. So, well, I'm sorry you're having to deal with that. Well, any other things that you want to share with us before we go?
So awful in this tape. My hair's all flat. That was another. Yeah. It's been an experience, from when I got on that, when I went to I never knew my life could be changed as much as the military changed it. But I also learned about resiliency, and but I'm still learning. But I don't know if somebody is, I think the military gave me some of the, when I was telling a neighbor's son, when the helicopters, oh my gosh, the helicopters were flying over here for weeks. When I told him about me being strapped in a helicopter and hanging out to do aerial photography, and I did that on duty too in Germany, and,
Wow.
and that kid yelled, "Holy cow, you were badass!"
That's great.
Yeah, and so it's like, you know what? I've been a badass throughout my life. I've done things. I survived out on a reservation. I learned about things I never knew I'd learn about. Yeah, I'm pretty badass.
Well, I think we'll end it on that note.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time, and thank you for your service.
Thank you for yours, and thank you for thinking of me.